Hello everyone, and welcome to the 189th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Cersei Lannister from A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. Tywin Lannister was a larger-than-life terror who put the Seven Kingdoms under his thumb with shrewd brilliance and overwhelming cruelty that has seldom been matched in this world. Joffrey Baratheon terrorized his realm during his short reign with displays of callous brutality and sadistic glee, a boy king given power beyond what he should have ever held that was liable to destroy everything he'd been given. Cersei, though, the last great Lannister villain that I've yet to cover, lies somewhere in between, the wrongful queen of the Seven Kingdoms who brought ruin to her house and her world. Cersei is almost universally reviled by fans of this series, and for good reason. There aren't many characters in this story who have committed crimes as grievous as Cersei committed, and there are less still who are presented to us as nearly irredeemable and abhorrent as Cersei is. Her character is one that we love to hate, and that fact combined with her personality, gravitas, and dreaded actions have made her into one of the greatest and well-executed villains in not just this series, but the entire fantasy medium. And in this video, we're going to explore everything we're given in both the books and the show that made her into this wretched creature, so we might better understand how one woman born so high can fall so low. But before we begin, let's first talk about our theme sponsor for this video, Game of Thrones Legends. Game of Thrones Legends is a brand new mobile game available on both Android and iOS that allows you to assemble a team of your favorite heroes and villains from across Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. Craft teams consisting of anyone from Jon Snow to Rhaenyra Targaryen, pitting them against hordes of White Walkers and other iconic enemies from the franchise, as you solve dynamic match 3 puzzles to unleash your champion's special abilities and combo them with your other team members to unleash spectacular combos to vanquish your enemies. You can pair your champions with notable weapons from the show as well, like Arya Stark and her needle, or Jon Snow and Longclaw, immersing yourself further in the world of Ice and Fire that we've all come to know and love. You can also team up with your fellow players to fight for dominance on the global stage, with stunning visuals transporting you to places like the sandy dunes of Dorne or the frozen wastes beyond the Wall in the lands of Always Winter. You can even create your own unique Westerosi house to pit against others on the global stage, winning magnificent prizes in a bevy of tournaments and special events. The game itself will keep you occupied for hours, but to get you started on your journey, you can earn a special sign-up bonus by clicking the link down in the description or by scanning the QR code on your screen. And when you arrive in Westeros, you'll be greeted with 50 gold, 3,000 food, and a daily summon token to get you started on your journey. So don't wait, scan that code or click the link down below and join myself and thousands of others on an immersive journey through Westeros with all of your favorite characters from the series. Thank you Game of Thrones Legends for sponsoring this video. Like all children born into a great house of Westeros, Cersei Lannister never experienced anything less than privilege and wealth. Cersei Lannister was born in the year 266 AC at Casterly Rock to Joana Lannister and Tywin Lannister. Both her and her twin brother Jaime were said to be exceedingly beautiful babes that would mature into golden children of the Rock, whose beauty only flourished as they aged into adulthood. As a child, Cersei was mischievous, petulant, malicious, and bold, a girl who abided by her duty as the daughter of a great house when she was commanded to, but one that would take any opportunity she could to play out any youthful hijinks that crossed her mind alongside her brother, whom she often led into whichever caper suited her whims at the moment, as Jaime was her constant companion in their youth, as he had been in their mother's womb. Cersei and Jaime would sometimes swap clothes with one another, their countenances so like the others that no one would ever suspect when they had, which afforded Cersei the opportunity to occasionally be trained by Casterly Rock's man-at-arms and receive the elevated privilege and attention that a man born to a great house enjoys that a woman does not. Cersei's boldness even once brought her and her brother into the bowels of Casterly Rock, where their grandfather kept lions in cages, and Cersei even dared to touch one of these lions, who, fortunately for her, only licked her hand rather than tearing it off. Whenever she was forced to pal around with her fellow maidens, while Jaime was receiving the education necessary to shape him into a proper heir of Casterly Rock, Cersei would serve as their noble ringleader, dragging her friends along with her to any adventure, much like she did with Jaime. However, aside from her natural proclivity for recklessness, defiance, and cruelty, there are a few key things that had influence over young Cersei Lannister that shaped her into the elegant horror that she would become in her adulthood. Wealth and privilege surely had a hand in shaping her personality, as those who want for nothing are often predisposed to developing a heightened level of selfishness and haughtiness compared with those who want for everything. But her gender was without a doubt the single most defining factor in shaping Cersei Lannister into who she became. Though she was born a woman of high birth, being born this way was only the fourth most privileged station to be born into, with men and women of royal blood being first and second, and men of noble birth being third. Now this notion is irksome for many women within the world of Ice and Fire, as men have always been afforded far more advantages in a world ruled mostly by men than women have. for even a woman of noble birth is beholden to the noble men that surround her. But for Cersei, who was constantly surrounded by the mirror image of herself in male form, these feelings were made all the worse for her. Cersei was given the charge that all noble women are given, to become a paragon of beauty, grace, and elegance that her noble parents could one day present to a lord or prince in the hopes that they wed her. And her days were spent as any noble girl spends them, learning to sew, dance, sing, and dress to improve her chances of drawing in a suitable match. Jaime, on the other hand, was taken under their Lord Father's wing, so he might become noble, brave, chivalrous, and learned in all matters of state and political intrigue, so he would be well prepared when the day finally arrived, when he would take the seat of his mighty father and rule all of his vast holdings. To Cersei, this was markedly unfair, as not only did she desire to have the power and respect that her male family members were given, but she also held the belief that she deserved to be the one to rule because she was better suited for it compared to her gallant, but foolish brother. This was only made worse by the fact that her father was consistently the second, or even the most powerful man in Westeros, a lion of great strength and intelligence who commanded the respect and attention of all who crossed his path. And while Cersei may have never loved her father, as he was a hard man for anyone to love, she greatly respected and admired him, and most importantly, she saw within Tywin the heights of power and prestige, and in herself, she saw Tywin. From the moment she could comprehend who she was, what her father was, and what her brother was, Cersei held the belief that it was she who was the rightful heir of Tywin Lannister, believing that she held within herself all the traits that made Tywin into such an effective and capable leader. And the only reason that she wasn't the one being groomed for this position is because the gods had cursed her to be born a woman. These feelings would birth Cersei's lifelong hatred of her own gender. For though she was quite the capable woman, who used her natural and learned advantages to get the better of her foes to the best of her abilities, she loathed the fact that she was a woman. And there are many times in the novels where Cersei either laments this fact, or looks down upon other women around her for being useless fools, compared to the men that she surrounds herself with. And it's this desire to supersede the limitations placed upon her by her gender that often drives Cersei to reach beyond her capabilities, and err in grievous ways that harm her, in more ways than they help her. And it's her constant overreach into affairs she's incapable of handling that highlights something very dangerous about Cersei Lannister, that she thinks she's smarter than everyone else around her when she actually isn't, which will be important to keep in mind when we start discussing her actions in this series later on. To be fair though, Cersei's hatred of her own gender can't solely be blamed on her own views of herself, as Tywin was a demanding lordly father who treated his children like property, and Cersei, much like Jaime, had little to no say in how her life would play out. And even if she did have something to say about it, Tywin would have surely ignored her, a fact of her life that continued to dominate it well into adulthood, and even after she was made into a queen, which we can see when Tywin commands his daughter to marry again after he secures King's Landing. Now, because she has always thought so highly of herself from such an early age, Cersei developed into a malignant narcissist who has only ever been capable of loving herself. It's true that she professes to love Jaime and her children, and I don't doubt that she does, but her love isn't necessarily derived from the natural feelings one develops for their lover and their children, but from her love of herself. Because Cersei so loves herself, the only people she has ever truly been capable of loving were those that either mirrored her or those that came from her, and this notion is best exemplified by examining her relationship with Jaime and her children. Jaime notes several times throughout both the books and the show that it was never Cersei who came to him, it was he who always catered to her beck and call. Cersei does very little for Jaime besides offering him the warmth and physical pleasure of a lover, but Jaime does everything for Cersei, and I do mean everything. If Cersei needs protection, it's Jaime who always runs to her aid. If Cersei needs someone to confide in, Jaime is right by her side with open ears, and if Cersei needs someone killed for any reason, well, Jaime will make sure that happens as well. Two of the more pertinent examples of their one-sided relationship can be found in Jaime's induction into the Kingsguard, and in his return to Cersei after being held captive by the Starks, and being maimed by Locke and Zolo in the show and the books respectively. After living at the court of King Aerys II with her father for several years, in the hopes of finding a royal match for her, Cersei caught wind of her father's intent to marry Jaime to Lysa Tully of Riverrun when they were 15 years old. When Jaime arrived at King's Landing after being knighted, Cersei informed her brother of their father's intent, and after a night of lovemaking, she managed to convince him to join the Kingsguard so he could escape his intended vows to Lysa and live with her in the Red Keep when she was married to one of the Targaryen princes, so they could continue their love affair. Jaime was hesitant at first, but after a day and night of seduction, he relented, and Jaime agreed to join the Kingsguard. While this might seem like a sacrifice made for love, the decision to make this sacrifice wasn't made without heavy manipulation on Cersei's part, and though Jaime loved his sister with every fiber of his being, what he was asked to do on her behalf was a total derailment of any other life he might have led had he not joined the Kingsguard. For as many of you will be well aware, the Kingsguard make vows to hold no lands, nor titles, nor marry, and though being counted amongst the ranks of the White Cloaks is an honor that any true knight would count themselves lucky to hold, it's still something that changes your entire life, and if becoming a member of the Kingsguard has been a goal of yours, then that's a fine enough change to make. But if you're coerced into signing up, that's a different story, and considering Jaime had to make significant changes to his way of life to be with his sister, and Cersei had to do nothing, this is a perfect example of Jaime sacrificing quite a lot for their relationship, while Cersei enjoys the fruits of it without having to lift a finger. This plan wouldn't exactly work out though, as Cersei was unaware of just how low her father's relationship with Aerys had fallen, as when Jaime was appointed to the Kingsguard, Tywin chose to take his party, Cersei included, back to Casterly Rock, which just poured more salt onto the wound Cersei had convinced Jaime to suffer. Now when Jaime finally returned to Cersei after being held captive for 8 months, and being brutalized by Locke or Zolo depending on the medium, he was initially met with open arms by his sister, but his time in captivity and wandering with Brienne in the countryside had changed Jaime, and he was no longer a man who was willing to blindly acquiesce to his sister's wishes. Seeing this, Cersei immediately started giving Jaime the cold shoulder, and it was only after Cersei was taken captive by the High Sparrow that she returned Jaime to her good graces in the hopes that he would save her. What this highlights for us is the fact that even after months of enduring captivity and torment, and spending all of his efforts to make it back to his sister, Cersei's love for her brother hinges entirely on whether or not he's willing to be everything that she wants him to be. And if he isn't, then he's worth about as much to her as everyone else who surrounds her, which is to say very little. Though Cersei claims that Jaime is the apple of her eye and the love of her life, her love for him is conditional, and any true love is typically unconditional, so long as a person's partner doesn't commit some grave sin against them or others that makes loving them unpalpable. Yet more proof that Cersei has always, and will always operate according to what's best for her, no matter the circumstances. Another indicator that her love for Jaime isn't as ironclad as his love for her is, can be found in her infidelities. Some of these infidelities were committed to further her cause, or to protect her family, like her relationship with Euron in the show, or the Kettleblack brothers in the books, but her affair with her cousin Lancel was made purely out of carnal desire. You might be able to make the excuse that Cersei assumed her brother would find a companion of his own during their time apart to satiate his desires, but on some level, I'm sure Cersei was well aware that her brother would never welcome the affections of another woman due to his love for her. For Jaime was truly in love with his sister, and his love came before any of his baser desires. And if Cersei had truly loved Jaime, I don't believe she would have lain with another whilst waiting for her brother's release. Instead, she would have stayed as true to him as he was to her. One possible explanation for her frequent infidelities, though, might lie in the fact that Cersei has seldom been alone in her life, as she's always been attended by either Jaime, Robert, or her various servants, a dependence on the physical presence of others that's shown to us in her use of those servants, or people like Taena Merryweather, as bedwarmers after her relationship sours with Jaime upon his return from captivity. But bedwarming is not infidelity, and while every person has their needs, Cersei's willingness to lie with others in her brother's absence is just another instance of Cersei only doing what's best for Cersei, regardless of who her actions might hurt in the process. Now, as far as her children go, Cersei has always professed her love for them, but when she can, she tries her best to mold them into who she wishes them to be. Joffrey was more willful than his mother, so controlling him was near impossible, and Myrcella, while still being on her mother's mind, seems to have taken a backseat first to her elder brother, then her younger brother, both of whom Cersei was actively trying to mold into the kings they needed to be, and that she wanted them to be, much like she was second-rate in the eyes of her father. Tommen was the one who got the short end of the stick, for Tommen was far more malleable than his elder brother had been, and we often find Cersei berating and chastising him for his perceived weakness, instead of bolstering her son's natural talents and proclivities, because all that matters to Cersei is that Tommen becomes who she wants and needs him to be, not what he wants to be. However, it should be said that many a young lord and lady have had their lives decided for them by their parents, so how Cersei treats Tommen is pretty par for the course as far as noble parenting goes, but she seems to take it a step further when compared to other parents who occupy the same station, especially in the books, where at one point she punishes Tommen by forcing him to whip his own whipping boy until the boy is bloody to teach her son a lesson and toughen him up. So while Cersei's life has frequently been defined by her love for her brother and her children, that definition doesn't come from the love they share, but the love that she has for herself. And rather than her world being ruled by this love, it's ruled by vanity, vainglory, self-interest, and the ever-present hatred of her lot in life. As I stated earlier, Cersei has been rather strong-willed ever since she was a child, and even then she was prone to bouts of hatred and cruelty towards those who spited her. However, as strong-willed as she was, and as much as she despised the fact that she was a woman who received deferential treatment when compared to her brother, Cersei wouldn't truly learn what it meant to hate and to be cruel until the birth of her younger brother Tyrion. As most of you will be aware, Cersei's mother Joana died giving birth to Tyrion, a boy who was born with dwarfism, and who in the books at least, was born with some unfortunate facial features that elevated him to the status of a beast in his family's eyes, like his bulbous brow, pug nose, multicolored eyes, and shock of dark hair. And indeed, his life was ruled by the notion that he was some sort of monster who murdered his mother, bringing himself into the world. While this afforded Tyrion negative treatment from a good majority of his family members, and those outside of it, aside from her father, Cersei was without a doubt the one who hated her younger brother the most. I stated earlier that Cersei never truly loved anyone but her brother and her children, but it is possible that her mother can be counted amongst the people she loved as well. Joana was said to be a kind and loving woman who doted on her children, so Cersei had every reason to develop affection for her mother, which might explain why she bore so much hatred towards Tyrion. Cersei, who was ever the selfish woman, could not bear any slight against her person or any that she loved, and Tyrion taking her mother from her was the first and most grievous perceived slight that she had suffered. So because Tyrion took her mother from her, he would forever be marked as a villain in her eyes, one that she even felt inclined to physically torment when he was an infant. Perhaps if Tyrion wasn't born a dwarf, Cersei would have felt differently towards him, but even if he hadn't been, I doubt that Cersei would have treated him much better. But because he was born a dwarf, that only made things all the worse for their relationship. And while Tyrion would do much over the years to agitate that relationship, all the blame can be placed upon Cersei for taking it to such a dark place. And in the books, there's another factor influencing Cersei's treatment of her brother that we'll discuss in a bit. Now, as Cersei aged, she was forced to contend with several difficulties and misfortunes that further drove her into developing into a wretched person. First was the death of her mother, which traumatized Cersei and effectively left her without any parents to guide her, as her father was much too consumed with his own ambitions to properly raise his daughter. And without a mother, Cersei was raised by servants, and while they did educate her in the ways of womanhood, they failed to fulfill the role of a parent that could teach her the lessons she'd need to learn to mature into a fully realized adult. Second was her denial of her marriage to Prince Rhaegar by Aerys II, which she had been dreaming of and had been promised with since she were a young girl, shattering her hopes that the disadvantages presented to her by her gender might be alleviated by her obtaining the status of a queen. Then she had to contend with her plot to have Jaime by her side being foiled by her father's relationship with the king, which instilled further misery within her and dampened her hopes for a brighter future alongside her lover. Some of that misery would be lifted once Robert's rebellion had concluded and she married a new king. But even with the title of queen secured, she had to suffer through a relationship with a man who had never loved her and who would frequently slight her with his excessive drinking and adulterous behavior. These experiences would do much to transform Cersei into the cold and unfeeling woman we're presented with at the beginning of this story. But something else that she experienced in her youth bore heavily on Cersei's mind for her entire life: the prophecy foretold to her by Maggie the Frog. In both the books and the show, this is an instance of Cersei's innate cruelty shining through even at a young age. For Cersei, once entering her home, woke Maggie from her slumber and threatened to have her tongue out if she didn't tell her and her friends their fortunes. But what's more important here than that is the fortune that she told. After tasting Cersei's blood, Maggie predicted that Cersei would marry a king, be deposed by a younger and more beautiful queen, and that she would have 3 children with golden crowns that would also serve as their golden burial shrouds. And in the books, she also predicted that she would be strangled by the Valonqar, which is High Valyrian for little brother. Now, Cersei may have not put much stock into these predictions, were it not for the fact that her companion that accompanied her to Maggie's home, Melara Heatherspoon, succumbed to the fortune Maggie gave her the day after it was given to her, that fortune being that she would soon perish, which she did when she drowned in a well. With what could have been a coincidence presented to her, Cersei took Melara's death as proof of Maggie's foresight, and so from that day forward, Cersei always had this prophecy in the back of her mind, something that caused her to be even more fierce in her protection of her station and her children, and even more cruel towards her brother. So with a young life spent despising her lot in life, a love of herself, and a few misfortunes presented to her, Cersei became a hardened, cruel, arrogant, power-hungry, and callous woman. She is often shown relying heavily on wine to dull her senses, and because she's so petty, the smallest of slights are often met with the highest cruelties, and she is a woman who commits numerous atrocities in service to her own ambitions, and to a lesser extent, to protect those who she loves. And Cersei's actions in this story are some of the most destabilizing acts taken by any character in this series that upends and destroys thousands, if not millions of lives. As I stated earlier, Cersei imagines herself to be Tywin Lannister in female form, and while there are many times in this series where her dreaded plots result in monstrous wins for herself, more often than not, Cersei finds herself a victim of her own schemes in some way or another. Her plan to murder Jon Arryn once he discovered the truth of her children's parentage, and her relationship with Jaime, was fairly airtight, and it's perhaps the one dark act she took that she executed well, as if it weren't for the scrutiny of Ned Stark and the realization that the Baratheon genetic profile supersedes that of their mates, in all likelihood, this plan would have gone off without a hitch. But it's what comes after this act that shows us the short-sightedness of Cersei Lannister and how dire her lack of foresight is to the fulfillment of her plans. One of her greatest errors lies in her rearing of Joffrey. Cersei had successfully deluded herself into believing that her son was a paragon of nobility and virtue that was destined to become the greatest king Westeros had ever been graced with. No matter what sordid situation her son managed to get himself into, Cersei always sided with her son, chalking up his transgressions as either being harmless or the acts of a growing boy, like in the case of a cat he disemboweled, or siding with him on any matter where he was accused of acting less than honorably, without ever considering that her son might in some way be in the wrong, like with the ordeal with Arya and Nymeria. Just as Cersei believes herself to be a paragon of perfection, so too does she hold that belief in her children. So of course in her mind, Joffrey could be nothing less than her pristine prince, who could do no wrong. And along with his father's indifference toward him, Cersei's enablement of his behavior that she herself displays in a more subdued manner, shaped Joffrey into the monster that he became. It was only once he donned his crown and ordered Ned Stark to be executed that she finally realized what she had wrought. But even then, her efforts to cow her son and curb some of his darker desires were flimsy. And though her incestuous relationship with Jaime was the catalyst for the War of the Five Kings, Joffrey's wild unpredictability and wanton cruelty are what fanned the flames of that war. For if the situation with Ned had been handled differently, it's likely that some sort of political solution could have been reached without the need for the war at all. Or it would have made it so the war was only relegated to a fight against Stannis and Renly rather than the Iron Islands, the North, the Reach, and everyone else aligned to the aforementioned brothers. Some of her follies in this regard are alleviated by the arrival of her brother Tyrion in King's Landing, but because of her less than stellar relationship with her brother, what could have been accomplished to prevent further harm to their house if they worked together was sabotaged by her overwhelming hatred for her brother. There are moments where they work together, and in those moments, things tend to go well for the pair. But on the whole, Cersei's lesser opinion of her brother serves as another case of Cersei's inability to see the bigger picture, as quarreling with her brother and attempting to outmaneuver him in any way she can is more important to her than an army that's quite literally about to descend upon her home and destroy everything she holds dear, to the point that Cersei even conspires with one Sir Mandon Moore to have Tyrion killed during the Battle of the Blackwater. After the battle is won, things return to a sense of Cersei normalcy as she continues to harass her brother, and she tries her best to come to terms with her waning hold on power now that her father has entered the city. But her father's overrule of her world was nothing compared to the terror that Margaery Tyrell and her grandmother brought upon her. To solidify their alliance with the Tyrells, Tywin marries Joffrey to Margaery, and within short order, Margaery proves herself to be more of a master of feminine wiles than Cersei could have ever hoped to be, and she quickly finds herself in Joffrey's good graces. But other than being a thorn in her side when it comes to Joffrey, there are two reasons in particular why Margaery proves to be Cersei's greatest challenge to date. One is because Cersei is ever mindful of Maggie the Frog's prophecy, and she assumes that Margaery is the foretold queen that's poised to usurp her, which causes her immense amounts of distress. But more importantly, Margaery is who Cersei believes she is. She's smart, beautiful, charming, and charismatic. She plays the game better than Cersei does, and she is loved by everyone not just for her beauty, but for who she is, something that Cersei was never quite able to achieve due to the faults in her personality. And just like Cersei, she has an older and wiser family member guiding her actions that gives her an edge in whatever court intrigue she's involved in. Only unlike Cersei, Margaery actually listens to her grandmother. For a time though, Cersei's ire is pointed elsewhere when Joffrey meets his untimely end and the blame for his murder is placed on Tyrion, though that ire is actually wasted on him. But with their highly negative shared history, there was never any hope that Cersei would place the blame elsewhere. As vicious as Cersei's treatment of her brother is during this whole affair, the death of her father would unlock a whole new side of Cersei that was better left caged. And from here on out, it's a slow march towards death for House Lannister, with Cersei leading the procession. Refusing to see the value in placating the Tyrells, Cersei slights them at every chance she's given, filling her small council with mediocre sycophants who in typical Cersei fashion only harm her efforts to control her position. During this period is when she begins to use the disgraced Maester Qyburn to the fullest extent of his abilities, offering him plenty of living subjects to torture so he might further his studies into the black arts. And while Cersei feasts in the Red Keep with her sycophants, numerous people, like her one-time pawn Felice Stokeworth, scream in the black cells below. With Margaery controlling Tommen far more efficiently than she had Joffrey, Cersei feels forced to take desperate measures and does the unthinkable. She arms the Faith Militant, hoping to use their numbers to augment her own forces and use her newfound relationship with the High Sparrow to eliminate Margaery and the Tyrells' hold over her and her son. Throughout all this, Cersei believes herself to be this master tactician who is one-upping her foes at every turn, but in actuality, she's just tripping over her own feet. which becomes quite evident when her plot against Marjorie backfires so severely that it sees her imprisoned and then humiliated when she's forced to make her walk of atonement. This is as far as her character goes in the books, and we'll just have to wait and see if her story plays out the same way that it does in the show. But in the show, we see that the mission she sent Jaime on to recover Myrcella and Dorne fails when Ellaria Sand poisons her before she begins her voyage home, which drives Cersei further into despondency and rage. And when the time comes for her to take her revenge on the Tyrells and the Faith, Cersei displays just how barbaric she can be and how monumentally stupid she is in the process. In one of the most diabolical masterstrokes in TV history, Cersei manages to eliminate all but one Tyrell, her uncle Kevin, and the Faith militant that she plagued herself with by blowing up the Great Sept of Baelor in a storm of sickly green wildfire. And she's also granted the pleasure of seeing, or rather hearing, her chief tormentor during her imprisonment, Septa Unella, being tortured by the revived Mountain. But this act had the unintended consequence of shocking her good-natured son Tommen, who decides to take his own life following this event. And Cersei, who was distraught over the death of her son initially, dares to make the claim to Jaime that Tommen betrayed them by ending his life, showing us once again how cruel Cersei can be to even those that she claims to have loved. Now, dealing with the Faith in one stroke was a smart move, but eliminating her uncle, who was the only good advisor she had left, and sullying her alliance with the Tyrells, whose forces she desperately needed to augment her own in the wars to come, left her floundering in a world where there were few who felt inclined to ally themselves to her cause. Roose Bolton had become defiant in the north, which then leads to the reign of Ramsay, and then his subsequent defeat by House Stark with the help of Littlefinger, who had pretended to be her ally as well, as Littlefinger is wont to do. Walder Frey and House Frey are eliminated by Arya, and the Tyrells, the Ironborn faction under Yara, and the Dornish under Ellaria, have formed an alliance with one another as well as Daenerys to crush Cersei. With a bit of cunning though, cunning that her father might have been proud of in the wake of all her failures, Cersei manages to get the better of these foes in a few ways. She convinces the only neutral party left in the Seven Kingdoms, Euron Greyjoy, to join her cause by promising to marry him once the war is over, and her alliance with him secures herself a victory against Ellaria, her daughters, and the Dornish, whom he captures and delivers to Cersei so she can exact her revenge on them for murdering her daughter, and a victory against Daenerys and the Tyrells when Jaime fakes them out at Casterly Rock and captures Highgarden, which grants her revenge against Olenna, something she realized was even more central to her sensibilities after Jaime revealed that it was Olenna who had Joffrey poisoned. However, that's about all the victories she's granted. When Daenerys decides to personally enter the fray, she massacres an entire Tarly and Lannister host with Drogon, which should have been the moment where Cersei saw the writing on the wall. But even after making a temporary truce with Daenerys so they can fight the true threat to the kingdoms, the dead, Cersei chooses not to send her forces north to deal with the White Walkers so she can have the upper hand once the battle with the dead is over, and Daenerys inevitably turns her sights back on Cersei, which causes Jaime to abandon her. Though she manages to secure a contract with the Golden Company, even the presence of these mercenaries isn't enough to save her from what's to come. She secures a small victory when Euron manages to kill one of Daenerys' dragons, but after that, it's straight to the Battle of King's Landing, and a crushing defeat as Daenerys lays waste to the city and everything Cersei had worked to achieve, the prophecy of the younger and more beautiful queen destroying her finally coming true. Now, I've offered you all a brief overview of everything Cersei has done, so we can discuss something that, more than her personal acts of vengeance and barbarity, defines the evil of Cersei Lannister, the influence she's had over this world, and the harm that it's caused so many people. And that all falls back onto Cersei's short-sightedness and the unexpected consequences that she could have expected that result from that short-sightedness. The first thing I'd like to discuss is something that we might not be able to blame Cersei for, but is something that needs to be said regardless, that being her coercion of Jaime to join the Kingsguard, and how that coercion helped set the stage for the defeat of Aerys Targaryen. When Cersei managed to convince Jaime and the king to give him a position in the Kingsguard, her father chose to relinquish his duties as Hand of the King, because after suffering many slights over the years from his liege, Aerys robbing Tywin of his heir was the final straw that broke the camel's back, and because Tywin abandoned Aerys, the Targaryens ended up losing Robert's rebellion. Now, it might seem like a stretch to claim that Tywin's absence from Aerys' alliance is what brought him defeat, but hear me out. Tywin's relationship with Aerys was quite rocky at the time Jaime was placed in the Kingsguard, so it is possible that something would have occurred that would have caused Tywin to resign regardless. But considering he had suffered so many slights already, I doubt that Tywin would have chosen to leave Aerys' service if Jaime hadn't been elevated to the Kingsguard. Aerys' court after Tywin's departure was dominated by incompetent sycophants, and while the combined might of the Crownlands, the Dornish, and the Tyrells still made for a sizable force that could contend with Robert's alliance of the Stormlands, the North, the Riverlands, the Vale, and eventually after Rhaegar's death, the Ironborn, Tywin's neutrality in this war significantly dampened the Targaryens' chances of winning or gaining a favorable outcome should they lose. Tywin was one of the most capable battle commanders in all the Seven Kingdoms, and if he had been at the head of the Targaryen war effort, he could have either defeated Robert's alliance, or at the very least, made his victory much harder to achieve due to the presence of his forces in the Targaryen alliance. Even if Robert had defeated Rhaegar at the Trident, it's entirely possible Tywin could have brokered a peace between the Baratheons and the Targaryens. With Rhaegar dead, the villain who had stolen Robert's love, Robert would have been much more amenable to reaching some sort of diplomatic solution, and I imagine Tywin could have figured out a way to depose Aerys in some way or another, and guarantee to Robert that things would change under the rule of his new heir, who was still a young child that could be molded into a proper king. A king that he could then promise his daughter to, so he could achieve his original goal of securing a Targaryen match for Cersei. Jaime may have still chosen to stay in the Kingsguard, but it's possible that Tywin could have managed to convince him to leave, which would have left a content Tywin at Casterly Rock with his heir, a new king trained to be a good king, with a Lannister at his side, and Robert Baratheon back at Storm's End to reign as Lord of the Stormlands, where he could do far less harm with his drinking and his philandering. And all the problems that resulted from Robert's reign, and the turmoil that occurred following his demise, could have been prevented, and the realm would have known peace. Now, the reason I say that we might not be able to really blame Cersei for this, is because she couldn't have known what the consequences of her father's departure from Aerys' service would have wrought. But it still stands that Cersei's selfishness not only altered Jaime's life, but the course of events that forever changed the Seven Kingdoms, and harmed millions of other lives. Regardless, after marrying Robert, there's a decision that Cersei made that I think we can definitely blame her for, refusing to have Robert's children. I don't blame Cersei for despising Robert and her marriage to him, because he was a horrible husband to her, a drunken oaf who frequently cheated on her, never loved her, and even savaged her physically whenever he made love to her, as seldom as that was. But early on in their marriage, Cersei became pregnant with Robert's child and chose to cleanse herself of it by drinking moon tea. And in the years after, Cersei admits that whenever Robert took her to bed, that she made sure that he never spilled his seed inside of her, so she'd never have to carry one of his children. Understandable as well, as if you hate the man you're married to, then why would you want to carry his children? However, when you consider the social structure and politics of the world of Ice and Fire, that was a pretty bad decision, especially when she was engaged in a relationship with her brother and conceived 3 children with him. Now, Cersei's relationship with her brother, while taboo, isn't something that's necessarily good nor evil. I wouldn't recommend anyone enter into a physical relationship with their twin, but if 2 consenting adults decide to do this, well then love is love, and it is what it is. What you could claim as evil, though, is infidelity, but considering Robert had a different woman in his bed every night, I don't think it's fair to fault Cersei for being adulterous here. The biggest issue is that Cersei not having any true-born children with Robert made it so that if her children's true parentage were discovered, terrible things would occur for herself, her children, and everyone allied to her, which it was, and did. And Cersei never accounted for this problem because she assumed that her relationship with Jaime would never be discovered. While that was possible, there was always a chance that it would be. And while she and Jaime would have suffered some dire consequences if she had a true-born child of Robert's, there would have been no issues with the succession. And I'm sure some sort of political solution could have been reached, or a lesser war might have flared up that wouldn't have caused nearly as much harm as the War of the Five Kings did. But Cersei couldn't see past her own desires and her overwhelming hatred of her husband to see these possibilities. And everything horrible that occurs under Cersei's watch can be traced back to her relationship with Jaime and how she mishandled it. And it's entirely possible that none of the events of this story would have ever occurred had she been more cautious and mindful of her actions. Joffrey would have never become king, and so he would have never died, nor would have Tommen, nor Myrcella. Her relationship with Tyrion would have still been atrocious, but her father would have never been murdered, and the realm wouldn't have been thrown into such disarray under her leadership. Leadership that sealed her own fate, as well as her brothers, her children's, and countless others both innocent and guilty. But all of these things and more did occur, and while many close to her suffered as a result, the real suffering lay with the small folk, countless innocent men and women whose lives were either destroyed or ended due to the poor decision-making of one entirely self-centered woman, one who would have destroyed all the Seven Kingdoms and everyone living in them to make herself into who she believed she was, but surely wasn't. A woman who could not get past the faults in her character to circumvent the dread fate that was prophesied for her when she was only a girl. Prophecies are interesting aspects of any story, as depending on the story, prophecies aren't guarantees. They're just predictions of what will occur should a person continue on their current course. And indeed, if Cersei had made some better choices, in all likelihood, none of the things Maggie the Frog predicted would have come to pass. Her coaxing of Jaime into the Kingsguard could have made it so she never married Robert. Siring a single child with Robert could have made it so her 3 golden children never had to suffer untimely deaths. And if that happened, she would have never become the sole queen of Westeros and been struck down by a younger and more beautiful queen. Who knows what will happen in the books, but I'm sure she'll meet her end at Tyrion's hands, as Maggie predicted, and that also could have been prevented, not only by treating her brother better, but if the situations that she created, that we've already discussed, never occurred. In the end, as much as we can sympathize with Cersei for some of the misfortunes she's had to suffer that were out of her control, Cersei Lannister is ultimately the architect of her own misery, a cruel, callous, and spiteful woman who more often than not catered to her own desires and dealt in darkness, darkness that brought ruin upon her house, many other houses, and many more innocents. And for all that she was and all that she did, Cersei Lannister will always be remembered as the Queen of Evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Cersei? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. And of course, don't forget to check out Game of Thrones Legends by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link down below, where you'll be greeted with 50 gold, 3,000 food, and a daily summon token once you get into the game. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.